What comes to your mind when I say the IMF? For most people, it's just 3 letters. A distant institution. Something abstract. Something that feels far removed from daily life. But for me, one number instantly appears. $1.4 trillion. That's how much developing nations spent in 2023 just to service their foreign debt. Not to pay it off. Not to build anything. Just to pay interest. That's money that could have built schools, hospitals, clean water systems, roads, power grids. Instead, it vanished into financial centers in Washington, London, and Paris, disappearing into spreadsheets and corporate profits, while entire nations remained trapped in poverty. Now, when someone borrows money, repaying it makes sense. That's not the problem. The problem is the system behind it. Because for every dollar of aid flowing into the global south, $14 quietly flow back out through unfair trade, profit extraction, corporate manipulation, and debt servicing. Over the past 60 years, an estimated $62 trillion has been drained from developing nations. Extracted. Not traded. Not earned. Taken. And standing at the very center of the system is the International Monetary Fund. The IMF. The global debt enforcer. We're told the IMF exists to rescue countries in crisis. That it provides emergency lifelines. That it offers stability. But in reality, it often chains nations to endless austerity, forcing them to trade sovereignty for survival. Today, developing countries carry over $31 trillion in debt. Compare that to the United States, which owes over $38 trillion, and suddenly the numbers don't look so extreme. But there's a crucial difference. The U.S. prints the world's reserve currency. Developing nations don't. They borrow in dollars, but earn in weak local currencies. And no matter how much they reform, restructure, or sacrifice, their debt never seems to shrink. Instead, life gets harder for ordinary people. Nearly 60% of low-income countries now face debt distress. That means they struggle just to meet interest payments. In many nations, governments now spend more money paying creditors than they do on healthcare, education, or infrastructure. And every few years, the same cycle repeats. A country runs out of cash. The IMF arrives, promises stability, offers a loan, and hands over a thick instruction manual on how to restructure the entire economy. But the numbers tell a darker story. Independent evaluations reveal that countries under IMF programs consistently grow slower than expected. On average, economic growth in the first year of IMF intervention falls 1.5 percentage points below projections. That's not a small error. That's entire economies slowing down when they were supposed to be recovering. And when you look at who actually controls the IMF, the picture becomes even clearer. Out of nearly 190 member nations, the United States alone holds veto power over major decisions. The Global North holds 9 times more voting power than the Global South combined. Officially, it's a global institution. In reality, it functions like a financial boardroom dominated by the world's richest countries. And if that doesn't resemble colonialism, it's hard to imagine what does. Colonialism never truly disappeared. It simply changed form. Instead of armies and empires, modern control operates through debt, interest rates, and economic policies written thousands of miles away. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to the moment when nations first gained political independence, only to fall into financial dependence. By the mid-20th century, the world stood on the edge of transformation. Between 1945 and 1960, countries across Asia and Africa finally broke free from European colonial rule. Flags were raised. National anthems were written. Independence was celebrated. But political freedom didn't erase centuries of economic destruction. Borders had been drawn by foreign hands. Tribes split. Rivals forced together. Economies stripped of industry. What remained were hollowed-out states with no infrastructure, no capital, and no industrial base. Colonial powers often claimed they had invested in their colonies. They pointed to railways, ports, and roads. But those railways led only to ports. Those roads existed only to transport raw materials out faster. These weren't investments in development. They were tools of extraction. So when independence finally arrived, newly freed nations inherited debt, division, and economic collapse. And when a country is born broke, it does the only thing it can. It borrows. That's where the IMF enters the story. In 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered in the small American town of Bretton Woods. Their mission was to design a financial system that could rebuild the world after World War II and prevent another global collapse. Out of that meeting emerged two institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. At the heart of this system was a brilliant economist named Harry Dexter White. Born into poverty, he understood hardship. He believed financial stability could prevent global chaos. His intentions were genuine. The IMF was meant to provide short-term loans to help countries recover from temporary crises. But temporary solutions have a way of becoming permanent traps. By the 1970s, the global economy was shaken by oil shocks, inflation, and the collapse of the Bretton Woods currency system. Developing nations borrowed heavily just to survive. By the 1980s, their debts had exploded. And that's when the IMF shifted from emergency rescuer to permanent economic overseer. New bailout programs came with strict conditions known as structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. Governments were ordered to slash public spending, devalue their currencies, privatize state industries, remove trade barriers, and open their markets to foreign corporations. In theory, these reforms would stabilize economies. In reality, they dismantled them. Factories shut down. Jobs vanished. Local industries collapsed under competition from multinational giants. Imported luxury goods filled shop windows while unemployment soared. Economic growth appeared on spreadsheets, but everyday life deteriorated. Public services crumbled. Education budgets shrank. Hospitals lacked supplies. Entire generations grew up under austerity. The winners were always the same: foreign investors, multinational corporations, and a tiny elite class tied to global finance. Over time, structural adjustment was rebranded as conditionality. A softer word. But the control only deepened. Each loan installment depended on meeting IMF targets. Miss a deadline, and funding froze. Economies teetered. Governments lost autonomy. Entire national budgets became written in IMF offices thousands of miles away. Take Zambia. Between 2018 and 2021, debt repayments jumped from 20% to 38% of the national budget. During the same period, healthcare funding dropped. Education spending collapsed. Children paid the price of interest payments. And nowhere has this devastation been more visible than in Africa. After decades of IMF reforms, poverty has nearly doubled in absolute numbers. From 1979 to 1992, Africa's total GDP barely grew. Manufacturing collapsed. Exports declined. Capital fled the continent at an estimated $88 billion per year. Wealth drained faster than it could ever accumulate. Foreign corporations bought mines, ports, utilities, and energy networks. Governments lost control over their own resources. Growth turned into extraction. Investment became exploitation. The same system soon spread beyond the global south. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Western economists rushed in with IMF-backed shock therapy. Prices were freed overnight. Industries were sold. Social systems dismantled. The economy imploded. Life savings vanished. Poverty exploded. Life expectancy fell. And from the ashes emerged a handful of oligarchs who bought entire industries for pennies. Russia had every resource needed for prosperity. But rapid privatization turned strength into collapse. The same pattern repeated in Latin America. Argentina privatized under IMF guidance. Capital flooded in. Then came the crash. Banks froze. Currency collapsed. Millions fell into poverty. Again. And again. And again. Time after time, the same formula produces the same outcome. Yet the IMF continues to present itself as a neutral savior. A global firefighter. A safety net. But history tells another story. One of economic domination, policy control, and structural dependency. So when the IMF speaks of reform and stability, we must ask, stability for whom? Prosperity for whom? Development for whom? Because for billions of people across the world, IMF policies haven't brought prosperity. They've brought austerity, inequality, and endless debt. And maybe the greatest tragedy of all is that this system convinces nations that suffering is the price of survival. If you made it this far, leave a globe showing Europe-Africa in the comments. It lets me know you're still here. And if you want to understand how financial systems shape power, check out my next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.